16 nights on a cruise is a lot. Earlier this year we spent 16 nights on board Virgin Voyages Brilliant Lady, sailing all the way from Miami to Los Angeles, including a full transit of the Panama Canal. And before we went, we had one huge question. 16 nights is a long time, even for us. Would it be too long? And who is this itinerary even for? So if you're thinking of booking this sailing or any of the Virgin Voyages Panama Canal itineraries, here's everything we think you should know before you go. If you've watched us before, you'll already know we are big fans of Virgin Voyages. Adults only, amazing food, that grown-up feeling we've come to love. We usually choose our voyages based on the ship and the price, rather than the itinerary. Honestly, we don't really care where we're going, we just love being on board, but this sailing was different. At 16 nights, even we had to stop and wonder whether this was really for us. Suddenly, the itinerary actually mattered. The Panama Canal was obviously the headline act, but after Miami, every port was new to us, and after Colón, it was new territory for Virgin Voyages too. So, after spending over 2 weeks on board, visiting 7 destinations and crossing from the Atlantic to the Pacific, was it actually worth it? If you've done a transatlantic crossing, you'll be well accustomed to those 8-day stretches at sea. Love them or loathe them, they're just a part of crossing an ocean. This sailing is actually longer than some of the transatlantic crossings we've done, but strangely, it never felt longer. That's because the rhythm is completely different. Just as you start settling into ship mode, you arrive somewhere new. Then, after a busy day exploring, the next sea day or two almost feels like a chance to recover, rather than another day waiting for the next port. On a transatlantic crossing, your holiday almost feels split in two. One half is that huge block of sea days, and the other is a much more port-intensive stretch. Here though, every few days you get excited about arriving somewhere new. Then, just as you've had enough walking around in the heat, you're back on board with a few sea days to slow the pace again. We never had more than 3 sea days in a row, and that created a really nice rhythm that kept the whole 16 nights feeling surprisingly fresh. One thing we noticed on a sailing this long was that we actually relaxed more. On a 7-night cruise, it's easy to think, we need to do that show tonight because it's our only chance. Here, there was always tomorrow. If we didn't fancy doing something one day, it really didn't matter because there was always another opportunity later in the cruise. It made the whole holiday feel much less rushed. By about day 5 or 6, it stopped feeling like a holiday and just started feeling like normal life, except normal life happened to include incredible food, ocean views, and somewhere new every few days. So before we sailed, we assumed the biggest challenge would be the length. In reality, it really wasn't. In fact, the way this itinerary is paced made 16 nights feel much more manageable than we'd expected. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's for everyone. Cartagena was our first port of call, and after 2 sea days, it actually felt like the perfect place to start the itinerary. First impressions, busy, really busy. From the moment we stepped off the ship, there were coaches everywhere, but despite how chaotic it looked, Virgin had the whole process running completely smoothly. We were off the ship, onto our coach, and on our way far quicker than we'd expected. We chose Virgin's Mangrove Eco Canoe excursion, partly because it offered something a little different from just wandering around the old town. Along the way, we got a whistle-stop tour of Cartagena itself, and it's exactly what you'd hope for. Colourful colonial buildings, lots of character, plenty of history, but also somewhere that feels lively and a little hectic in places. The canoe trip itself was probably the biggest surprise. We'd imagined being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nature, but in reality, you're never that far from the city. You can hear birdsong one minute and traffic the next. That said, it was still a really peaceful way to spend an hour, gliding through the mangroves, spotting herons, watching all the bird life around us. It made for a really relaxing morning, even if it wasn't quite the wilderness experience we'd built up in our heads. One thing we also appreciated was that the excursion never felt rushed. It included the canoe trip, a couple of local drinks, a cultural performance, and enough of Cartagena to feel like we'd experienced the city without trying to cram absolutely everything into a few hours, like on one of those notorious tourist trap excursions where you're herded around like cattle. Before heading back on board, don't make the mistake of walking straight back to the ship. The cruise terminal here has its own wildlife sanctuary, completely free to wander through. with flamingos, monkeys, anteaters and all sorts of birds. It's only a short walk, but it's genuinely one of the most unique cruise ports we visited. As for the excursion itself, yes, we do think it was worth it. Could you organise something similar independently for less? Probably, but for us, on a port where traffic can be unpredictable, having everything organised by Virgin and knowing the ship wasn't sailing without us was worth paying a little extra for. If Cartagena eased us into the itinerary, Colón completely changed the pace again. Now, we'll be honest, if you're planning to get off and explore Colón by yourself, we'd probably think twice. It's one of the poorer parts of Panama, and after speaking to both our guide and crew on board, this is definitely somewhere we'd recommend booking an organised excursion. But don't let that put you off, because once you leave the city behind, this became one of the highlights of this entire cruise. We chose Virgin's Nature in Motion Panama Canal Adventure, which takes you out onto Gatun Lake in search of Panama's wildlife. Gatun Lake, the huge man-made reservoir, forms part of the Panama Canal itself, honestly exceeding every expectation we had. Within minutes, we'd already spotted wildlife, before heading out across the lake, weaving between enormous container ships, making exactly the same canal crossing we'd be doing ourselves the following day. The best part wasn't really ticking animals off a list, it was just being out there. One minute you're racing across the lake alongside some of the world's biggest cargo ships, and the next, you're drifting silently through the jungle, listening to howler monkeys echoing across the water. It's one of those sounds that genuinely gave us goosebumps the first time we heard it. This ended up being one of the best cruise excursions we've ever done. At around $100 each, we actually thought it represented really good value. Could you arrange something similar yourself? Probably, but this is one of the ports where we were more than happy to let Virgin take care of absolutely everything. Day 6 brought the headline moment of this entire itinerary, the Panama Canal Transit. Now, if we're being honest, this was the one thing that did most of the heavy lifting when we booked this sailing. 16 nights is a long cruise, but the chance to sail from the Atlantic to the Pacific through one of the world's most famous engineering achievements was something we couldn't really say no to, and having now done it, it absolutely lived up to the hype. If you want to see the full transit, it's an early start. Our alarm went off at 6 AM because we were approaching the first locks at around 7:30, and there was this real buzz around the ship. You could tell everyone knew this wasn't just any other sea day. The lifeboats had been moved into what Virgin calls Panama mode. Parts of the promenade deck were closed, and everywhere you looked, people were finding their spot to watch the ship enter the locks. If you've never really understood how the Panama Canal works, the easy way to think about it is it's like a canal lock but on a completely ridiculous scale. Rather than digging a channel all the way through Panama at sea level, ships are lifted up into Gatun Lake, cross the middle of the country, and are then lowered back down again on the other side into the Pacific. We were incredibly lucky to be invited to watch the first set of locks for one of the larger suites on board, and honestly, it was probably one of the best views we could ask for. Seeing the walls slowly getting closer as Brilliant Lady moved into the lock really puts into perspective the scale of the whole thing. If we could give you just one Panama Canal tip, it's this: don't watch it all from the same spot. Move around the ship throughout the lock transit. Watch the locks from the bow if you can, then look down from the side of the ship as you're inches from the lock walls. And when you're ascending the system, as you're leaving the final lock, head to the very back of the ship. Looking back from the aft and seeing the entire lock system stretching away behind you really helps you appreciate just how far you've been lifted above sea level. Even though you're still on a ship that's on water that's been lifted above sea level. It's one of those views that's easy to miss, but it ended up being one of our absolute favourites. But what really surprised us wasn't just the engineering, it was the atmosphere on board. Everyone was excited. People were lining the railings, balconies were full, the athletics club was packed, and even the crew were outside watching. It genuinely felt like everyone on board was experiencing this together. The one thing we'd say though, don't underestimate how long this day is. It's incredible, but you're outside for a lot of it, and Panama is hot. Very hot. By the time we reached Gatun Lake, we were definitely starting to feel the humidity, and as exciting as seeing the ship being lifted from lock to lock was, by the second or third lock, the decks were definitely quieter. Gary Bembridge perfectly summarises this as lock fatigue, and that sums it up perfectly, not because it wasn't impressive anymore, But because after watching the process for several hours, the excitement naturally settles down. There was still a buzz around the ship, but the locks had almost become a slight background activity. The middle section of the transit is probably where people will have very different experiences. You'll either be bored or love it. Once you're through the locks, you have several hours of crossing the lake, and whilst it's absolutely beautiful, it does slow down. But honestly, for us, that wasn't a bad thing. That slower section became one of our favourite parts. We grabbed a drink, found a spot to relax, watched the scenery go by, and it almost turned into a river cruise through the middle of Panama. There was something really special about having nowhere to be, nothing to rush off and do, and just watching the world go by. And that's probably the best way to describe the Panama Canal. It's not just one moment, it's not even just the locks, it's the whole day. The excitement in the morning, watching this incredible machine in action, crossing the Gatun Lake, and finally emerging into the Pacific. Was it hot? Absolutely. Was it a long day? Definitely. But was it worth it? Without a doubt. It's up there with some of the most special experiences we've had. Seeing those final gates open and realising we were about to sail out into a completely different ocean was a moment we'll never forget. Now, you'd think that after taking off something as big as the Panama Canal, the rest of the cruise would feel almost like an afterthought. Weirdly, it didn't. After the excitement of the Panama Canal, this itinerary did what it does best. A sea day to recover from the excitement before arriving at our next destination, Costa Rica. And this was actually quite a big moment for us, because for the first time ever, we decided to step away from the safety of a Virgin Voyages excursion and book something privately. If you've watched us before, you'll know we're very much ship people. We love the convenience of booking through the cruise line, and if we're honest, the thought of missing the ship and watching it sail away without us has always been enough to make us a little nervous. But today, we were trying something different, and we're so glad we did. Our first stop was something we'd been really looking forward to, meeting wild capuchin monkeys. And this wasn't at a zoo or an enclosure. We pulled up at the side of the road, walked a short distance into the jungle, and there they were. At first, they kept their distance, watching us from the trees. But after a little encouragement and a few biscuits, they slowly started coming closer. It's difficult to explain quite how special that moment was. These were completely wild animals, free to disappear back into the trees whenever they wanted, and yet there they were. And there we were, standing in the middle of a Costa Rican jungle with monkeys climbing onto our shoulders. The rest of the day was a brilliant mix of Costa Rican experiences. We sampled fresh local fruit, tried Costa Rican coffee and chocolate, and generally ate and drank our way through the country. Although by this point, after all that fruit, we did start questioning whether our stomachs could cope, and if we'd made a terrible mistake. The only thing we didn't do was the crocodile boat trip we'd originally planned. Unfortunately, an accident on the road meant that the journey time was increasing, and with this being a private excursion, we didn't want to risk cutting getting back to the ship on time too fine. The tour company handled it brilliantly. They changed the plan, took us somewhere else for food instead, and made sure the day still felt special. And this was probably the biggest takeaway from Costa Rica. Doing something independently felt like a big step for us, but having a smaller group meant the day could adapt when things didn't quite go to plan. We got back to the ship with plenty of time to spare, and we had one of those days that reminded us exactly why we love travelling. By day 10, we were actually really starting to appreciate one of the unexpected benefits of a longer itinerary. You don't have to make every single day a big adventure. On a shorter cruise, it's easy to succumb to the pressure. You've only got 1 week, every port feels like a one-time opportunity, and you want to squeeze everything in. But after nearly 2 weeks on board, we were quite happy to slow the pace down. By this point, we'd settled into a completely different pace of cruising. If you're someone who needs constant entertainment and a new port every day, 16 nights might feel like a stretch. But if you enjoy the ship just as much as the destinations, this is exactly where this itinerary starts to shine. So Guatemala became much more of a relaxed port day for us. No big excursion, no packed agenda, just a wander around, a drink, and some time to enjoy the surroundings. The port itself was a really pleasant surprise. There was a small shopping village, bars, and a really relaxed atmosphere, but the highlight for me was actually something we weren't expecting at all. Guatemala is home to one of the most active volcanoes, Volcán de Fuego, and you could just about see it erupting away in the distance. Once I spotted it, I became completely obsessed. There are excursions you can do out to the volcano if you fancy, but we were more than happy to relax with a cocktail on the ship and admire it from a safe distance. After such a busy few days exploring Cartagena, the Panama Canal and Costa Rica, Guatemala ended up being the perfect reset before our final stretch towards Cabo. After 3 sea days crossing the Pacific, we finally arrived into Cabo San Lucas, the final port stop before Los Angeles. Unlike the previous stops, Cabo felt much more like a traditional cruise destination. A busy marina, lots of excursion boats, plenty of tourists and souvenir shops. It definitely had a different feel to the ports we'd visited earlier in the sailing. Having chosen to do the culture and culinary delights of Cabo tour, our excursion started brilliantly, heading out by boat to see the famous arch, spotting sea lions along the coastline, and even trying our hand at glass blowing. The tequila tasting was a surprise highlight too, mainly because we discovered we actually quite like good tequila. The second half though, felt much more like the classic tourist conveyor belt. A few shopping stops, a very brief city tour, and a lunch that probably wasn't the authentic Mexican experience we'd imagined. Cabo isn't a port stop we'd particularly rush back to, but if we happened to be on a voyage that stopped there, we'd absolutely do a different excursion next time. And then, almost before we knew it, that was it. One final sea day later, we arrived into Los Angeles. So, was 16 nights too long? Actually, no. By the time we reached LA, we were absolutely ready to get off the ship. But that's very different from feeling like we'd had enough halfway through. At no point did we find ourselves wishing the cruise would hurry up and end. If anything, the itinerary almost tricked us into thinking it was shorter than it really was. Every few days, there was something new to explore, followed by just enough time at sea to properly relax before doing it all again. And that balance is probably this itinerary's biggest strength, but again, it won't be for everyone. One thing we noticed quite quickly on this sailing was that it attracted a very different atmosphere on board. It felt calmer, slower. People weren't trying to cram everything into 7 nights. There wasn't quite the same late night party energy you get on shorter sailings. Instead, people seemed much happier lingering over dinner, chatting in the bars, sitting out on deck watching the scenery go by, or throwing themselves into some of the enrichment activities. And that's probably the biggest clue as to who this itinerary is for. If your perfect cruise is late nights, wild parties, and squeezing as much in as possible, this might feel a little slow. But if your idea of a brilliant holiday is slowing down for a couple of weeks, properly switching off, enjoying the ship itself, and treating the journey as part of the experience rather than just travelling between ports, then honestly, we think this itinerary is one of the best Virgin Voyages offers. We boarded Brilliant Lady wondering whether 16 nights would simply feel like a longer Virgin Voyages sailing. It didn't. It felt like a completely different style of holiday, and that wasn't just because of the itinerary. Here's the bit that genuinely surprised us. It wasn't just the itinerary that made it feel different. That's only half the story, because on these longer sailings, Virgin quietly changes all sorts of things on board. Food is arguably one of the most important things on a sailing, and 60 nights is a long time to eat restaurant meals every night. Even if the food's excellent, eventually you start craving something lighter, something different, almost something a bit more normal. And honestly, yeah, by the end of the cruise, we probably had reached that point. The restaurants didn't quite seem so exciting, but Virgin clearly knows that. On sailings over 10 nights, they introduce additional restaurant specials, seasonal dishes, and limited time menus to help keep things fresh. And because you're on board for so much longer, you naturally stop feeling like you have to eat huge 3-course meals every night. We found ourselves mixing things up far more. Some nights we'd book a restaurant, other nights we'd grab something lighter in the galley, which also has daily specials. It made the whole dining experience feel much more sustainable over 2 weeks, and made us feel slightly less like bloated whales by day 16. Entertainment is another area where we wondered whether things might start feeling repetitive. On a short cruise, there's almost a fear of missing out. You're rushing between shows because you know you've only got one chance to see them. On a 16-night sailing, that completely disappears. Suddenly, there's always tomorrow. We found ourselves watching far fewer shows than we normally would, simply because there wasn't any pressure. Instead, we'd spend evenings chatting in a bar, sitting out on deck or listening to live music. And to fill those extra sea days, Virgin have started adding more enrichment activities. Chocolate tasting, wellness sessions, dance classes, crafts. Was every single one of them aimed at us? No, but that's almost the point. With 16 nights on board, you end up trying things you'd probably never have made the time for on a shorter sailing, and some of them became genuine highlights. It also has another unexpected effect. Because you're seeing the same crew members over and over again and spending longer in these smaller activities, conversations become friendships. By the end of the cruise, people know your name, remember your drink, ask how your day's been. The ship starts feeling much smaller than it actually is. So, after 16 nights, would we do it again? Absolutely, not because every port was perfect, not because every excursion was unforgettable, and not even because of the Panama Canal, incredible though it was. We do it again because of the pace. Somewhere along the way, this stopped feeling like a cruise where you were trying to fit everything in, and started feeling like life had simply slowed down for a couple of weeks. And perhaps that's the biggest difference between a shorter Virgin Voyages cruise and a 16-night one. On a short sailing, there's always something you're worried about missing. On this one, there was always tomorrow. If that's the kind of holiday you're looking for, we don't think there's a better itinerary in Virgin's fleet. If it isn't, that's absolutely fine too, because that's exactly why it's so different. We arrived into Los Angeles tired, slightly sunburnt, and definitely ready for home, yet somehow wishing we had just one more tomorrow on board. Have you done one of Virgin Voyages' longer sailings, or have you got one booked? We'd genuinely love to hear what you thought, or what you're most looking forward to, so let us know down in the comments. If you've enjoyed this review, we'd really appreciate a like, and if you're new around here, don't forget to subscribe for more cruise and travel adventures. And as always, a huge thank you to our wanderers for the extra support. If you want to join the gang, click the join button below. If you want to see how this voyage unfolded day by day, we'll pop the full Brilliant Lady series on screen now, along with another video YouTube thinks you might enjoy. We'll see you over there if you fancy watching. If not, we'll catch you on the next adventure. Thanks for watching. Bye!